Let's start with your face, because
Good to put a face to the voice, the golden throat.
So you go ahead and introduce, and then I'll pan down, and we'll get started.
And am I going to look right into the camera?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so welcome to the first ever video podcast of How to Draw Cartoons by Alaskan cartoonist Jamie Smith. I've been the cartoonist for the Fairbanks Daily News Miner for over 25 years now, and I teach at the University of Alaska Fairbanks beginning and intermediate and advanced drawing classes in the fine art department. During the summer, for the past 8 years, we've done a cartoon and comic art class through UAF summer sessions. It's been a really popular feature. Generally the first class to get waitlisted, and we have a whole spectrum of students that attend it. Since I schedule it for 6 p.m. onwards, 3 hours a night, 5 days a week in the drawing department. So we get a lot of non-traditional students from off-campus, non-degree seeking students. We have everything from retired folks to advanced placement high school students. And then we have art majors too, since it counts as a upper level studio art class. And during this 6-week class, we pretty much cover breadth and depth as much as possible of cartoon and comic art. The first week we start with character development, which is kind of a way to also cover by default materials and techniques. We start familiarizing ourselves with the tools of the trade, little craft secrets and things. And then we move into a single panel gag cartoons, which also covers editorial panels as well. Then the third week, we start to move into more of a sequential art, where we create strips which have gutters and start playing around with the concept of the passage of time. Then we do a little bit of storyboarding, maybe touch on a little bit about animation. We do a little bit of caricature. We move into one-page vignettes, short stories essentially for the medium. And then we start segueing into graphic novels, and we cover a little bit of interesting aspect of sequential art in the more traditional comic book genre, Marvel, DC, superhero type thing, where we do a collaborative exercise and we talk about script writing, and then a second different student will then pencil in that script, and a third different student will then ink it, and then the fourth student will scan and color the final. So we have a project at the end of that week. I think that would be the fourth week of the class, where it's a collaborative approach towards creating artwork, which is a unique attribute of sequential art. And then we move into the longer final projects of a minimum 3-page long or 5-page long piece by the students, and where we can interject that with all sorts of other in-class exercises, demonstrations, visiting artists, things like that. And so what I'm going to do today is just kind of walk through a single panel gag cartoon and how I go about, and it's going to have a little bit of a basic drawing, a little bit about materials, a little bit about technique, and I usually will start this process by going through my sketchbook, which I have probably at this point a 5-foot-high stack of them, so I will never run out of ideas, because this is a repository where I can sketch, doodle down some ideas over coffee or when I'm out with friends or what have you. And being raised by my parents were avid gardeners, so I like the metaphor of a mulch pile or a compost heap, where material can just kind of get shoveled in and it'll ferment, go through this period of incubation, where sometimes I will have a picture with no words or words with no picture. It's a chance for me to work out first some basic compositional design problems before I actually put pencil to paper for the final finished project. Many times there will be samples in here somewhere as well of and also field studies and things like that. from up at the museum from my drawing class. But this will be a chance for me, before I draw the real thing, the print version that will run in the newspaper, to kind of work out some design problems. Sometimes the doodle's good enough that I'll just scan it in and use that as the finished piece. Everything in here is generally done with my favorite ballpoint pen. I heartily recommend the free black ink pens from Gold Hill Liquor and Grocery on the Parks Highway. And so I'm going to flip through here and try to find a panel that might be particularly appropriate to this demonstration. Something fairly simple, but still is good enough to show some of the aspects that I want to cover and talk about here. So we'll use this one here, which again, I have a sketchbook out at all times, and as kind of keep a running commentary, take notes. Basically, it's all about taking notes. If you want to know where to get ideas, take notes. Eavesdrop on conversations when you're out at bars and cafes and things like that. So at some point, I believe my lovely fiance mentioned a few weeks ago something in passing, something about feeding. If you feed a moose glitter. I think I was complaining about glitter because I just did my first ever Sculpey thing, and I found out that it actually has glitter in it. I loathe glitter. So if you feed a moose glitter, then will the nuggets sparkle? So that's the question, and a lot of the same basic idea generation, asking yourself these questions. What if? So ask the question, what if? So what if you fed a moose glitter? Would the nuggets then sparkle? And so that all came from this little note, which was so good, I taped it out and stuck it up there. It's kind of like the manual version of cutting and pasting. And so here we have the actual ballpoint pen doodle. There's another sample of one just in pencil stage here, and where you'll see a lot of erasing and working over things, trying to get editing. And since you're doing a cartoon that uses pictures and words, you have to edit on both levels also. So this one is, I got every season of Game of Thrones, The Office, Breaking Bad, and Doctor Who. Bear sitting there with instead of a bowl of potato chips, we got a little bone in there. Have a bear coming in and a few flakes, but there's still grass down there, so we know what's going on here. It's kind of visually setting up the scene, and the backside of a big monitor TV, and there'll be stacks of DVDs here, which you can just see in pencil lines here. Things kind of got tweaked on the fly and shifting around to try to find the perfect camera angle for the scene and how to leave enough visual breathing room for the various visual elements, including the words, which I'll get to later. And then there's an additional caption, like a sub caption down here that says, technically it's not hibernation, it's torpor, which I actually ran into a biologist in the cafe yesterday and cleared that up, made sure that there is the difference between torpor and hibernation. I think that's the Alaskan ground squirrel exhibits torpor. They're not true hibernators. In other words, every once in a while they'll get up to defecate or eat or something, kind of like me in the winter. Anyway, so this is an example of the pencil stage, and then if I feel up for it and I have time for it, I'll just go ahead and kind of use the ballpoint pen for it. In this panel I wanted to draw for today, and it involves a nice little butt shot of a moose here looking down on a pile of moose nuggets, and somebody, maybe this will be me, I don't know, we'll put the little goatee on there. Making fun of yourself is always the best bet. And there's going to be one caption here that says marketing, and then down here will be another sub caption, if you feed a moose glitter, then the nuggets will sparkle. So I think this would be a good one for today, especially given the fact that we're going to have a protracted deconstruction of the process of drawing a single panel gag cartoon. It's a good thing I don't draw strips, or we'd be here all day. Hopefully it should just take a little bit of time here. And so pole vaulting over a moose turd, in other words. So when I'm penciling things out, I'll kind of interject here a little bit about materials that I'm going to be using. This is Strathmore Bristol board, pretty much the Budweiser of cartooning supplies. I should say the industry standard. There's 300, 400, 500 levels. Nice plate finish. This is a smooth Bristol board, basically really expensive cardboard. And this is a special surface to draw with pen and ink on because it's very smooth. There's another Bristol, which is vellum, which has a little bit more of a tooth, which is good for pastel penciling, things like that. But a smooth or a plate finish for the Bristol board is what you want to look for. And when I start inking, I'll show some examples of why. And for this, I usually will use a T-square at home on my drawing table in my studio, but this is the travel kit here. I'll start off with a general frame, okay, which is kind of fun to think about that you might instinctually think creatively that working within the confines of a panel border is restrictive, but it actually is not. I've heard from many, read about it and heard from interviews and talked to other cartoonists that actually working within the confines of a set constriction like this is actually forces you to be creative in a lot of ways. In other words, I always lecture my students, think inside the box, which goes against conventional instruction about think outside the box. No, think inside the box because then you have to be creative to work within those boundaries. And so I start off with pretty much a horizontal, generic, rectangular format here, and this is going to shift and change as need be throughout the process of this. And that's one of the things I want to try to do when I'm penciling things out is try to establish basic compositional factors here, because this is a drawing, and when the viewer looks at it, you want to utilize various devices to accentuate or direct the eye to a particular point of view. I have to establish the point of view within this composition. There are elements like foreground, midground, background, line weight that are all going to come into play because you want to, again, help the viewer go through the process. And it's the equivalent of well, they have the average view span is what, a couple seconds when people look at something. And if there's anything that hinders that, like lousy lettering or a confusing layout or words are crammed together or going off to the side, some beginning things, that will hamper or restrict the viewer's processing of this information here. So, okay, so we're going to start here, and I'm just going to kind of go off of this. Here's a good example, actually, I want to show real quick, too, of penciling. Here's an example of a fully penciled panel ready to go. This is going to be the Christmas Nuggets panel that will run in the paper. It'll be nicely colored when I'm done with it. It will also double as my Christmas card, and the original will double as a nice Christmas gift as well. But here we have a scenario where we have some bears coming in from downstairs, so the eye starts over here. Again, this is another convention that you can play around with. In the West, we're going to read from left to right, top to bottom, and I believe we also kind of process an image the same way. So when we start here, not to mention there's a pair of eyeballs, and so us being mammals with vision, we're going to look right at these eyes, and this bear is looking down, and so that would be a gaze direction, I guess, is another way to look at it psychologically. There's a pair of eyes that you first notice that, and then what is the bear looking at? And the eye is going to be led down here, and this figure is moving here. It goes to a partially eaten cookie and a spilled glass of milk, and then there's going to be this form here leading up to here, and these things in the fireplace are all leading up. And by this point, it's not going to become apparent, and maybe 50% of the people are going to miss out on the fact that Santa's legs are still inside the stockings tacked up on the fireplace here, because there'll be lots of nice lush color and texture and all sorts of things going on. And then there'll be little incidental details like moose nuggets instead of cranberries strung up on the tree, and fishing bobbers instead of glass baubles and whatnot. But here we have lots of strong directional lines and action leading the eye's view down through the panel. That's a really good example of penciling for that. And so now I'm going to start, when I get back to, so now we're returning back to the glitter nuggets panel here. Leaving alone the words for now, I'm going to establish ground plane here. I'm going to establish maybe some foreground elements. I'll go back over this so it becomes a little bit clearer. It might not be at this first pass here. I also just switched to these Ticonderoga nice black pens instead of graphite, or pencils instead of graphite ones, so I'll be able to beef up the lines and they'll be a little bit more visible. So what I've done here is establish a ground plane, and I can start assembling the elements on this. Basically, I've built the stage, now I'm going to put the characters on it, and I'm going to just kind of first sketch out some blobular shapes here. I never start up here with just the details. That's kind of the equivalent of when you're drawing a model or from a figure drawing class, starting with the eyelashes or each individual strand of hair, without having putting a body and then the head and then the hair on the head. Or drawing a hallway, you don't start with the doorknobs, you start with the linear perspective of establishing the plane for the wall and then the door and then the doorknob. So it's a very sequential assembling of elements. I don't want to crowd things too much either. I'm going to have a couple, the person and the moose coming from undertuck. Is that a word? I'm not sure. Where things are going to go underneath this panel, because this frame here, this view frame, a little snapshot, is going to be, the screen, I guess, if you will, for people, their entry point into the cartoon. My first lines, again, and I tell drawing students all the time, your first lines are never going to be the final ones. So I always sketch light, loose lines here, kind of establish things a little bit, see how things are going to play if I need to shift things around. Like now, I think I'm going to just extend this over just a little bit because that figure's a little crowded, so now I have a little bit of room to have it be clear that this person is kneeling. Okay. And so what I'm doing here, it doesn't make any sense right now at this point. It's still kind of blobular, vague, indescript shapes here. But I'm going to start mapping things out. Now that I have a body and I have a head, I can put a hat on the head. Put the eyes in, a nose, mouth, grinning. Actually, I'm going to change that from the original version and just have the mouth open instead of grinning. And I'm going to walk through the content of exactly what's going on here with this particular panel in a little bit. But so we're going to kind of lightly sketch out. This is known as a loose pencil as opposed to a tight one. That's because I'm the artist that's going to be inking this in, so I don't particularly need to worry about having anything exactly, and it's not going to be the same by the time I'm done inking it in. Things are going to change even more on the fly, so this is just helping me map things out. Again, some foreground element here of some grass. And I'm going to overlap as well, because since this is a drawing, again, there are some aesthetic or some criteria to start employing in that this is a picture plane. And in order to promote the illusion that it is a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional sheet of paper, there are some little tricks that work in drawing as well. And that would be this foreshortening and overlapping, working with foreground elements, background elements. I got to pay special attention here to the shapely moose butt. That's going to be probably the first thing that the viewer sees. And then, of course, this is an abstraction. Moose don't really look like this. Okay, so I have this leg coming down, this one, this leg, this one, and there's going to be a nice belly here, the foreleg, and another foreleg coming in over here. I think that works. Nope, better do that. Okay, again, I'll tighten these lines up once you don't want to spend time. One of the things about cartooning and drawing, it's quick, okay? So you don't want to waste too much time on the details here. So you might as well sketch things out first and make sure everything looks just perfect for this. Okay. Yes, I love drawing me with a moose because we both have such handsome goatees. Okay, and so we're going to have, again, this gaze direction thing where anybody normal is going to, immediately look at the moose's butt right there, right? And it's going to go from here to here to here to here. So there's going to be a visual flow moving through the panel as well. Okay, so the moose is going to be looking at, the moose will have kind of a nonplussed expression, or okay, which I'm sure moose do have, because, you know, we're funny monkeys. We're the species that did things like put moose turds on swizzle sticks and whatnot. So I'm sure that they're fairly bemused at some of our actions. And I'll change things on the fly a little bit more here. Generally don't even bother erasing. You should be sketching light enough that you don't have to erase. And we'll throw in some antlers here off to the side like that. And I think so far it's coming together here. I'm going to have this horizon line back here. I'll throw in some grass coming through here, so get that nice illusion, that depth, pushing that back. And I'm also going to expand it over on the left side here again as well, because I want to maybe throw in some of my iconic Alaskan spruce trees, which usually work their way into everything. This is actually, for those of our viewers keeping score at home, George Harriman's classic cartoon Crazy Cat. One of the nice things I really enjoyed about his work is he always had these little mesa rock formations in the background. Real strong sense of place. And it's kind of been a tongue-in-cheek little homage to him, that I have my little iconic spruce trees in here as well, which when I go to the East Coast and I hang out with other cartoonists, they're like, yeah, you're funny, but you should really learn how to draw trees. And I'm like, well, no, that's actually what they look like in Alaska, drunken forests. Okay, when I moved to Maine, and when I was studying in Georgia, other places that I go. And so now I've expanded it this way a little bit, and I've got a little bit too much dead space down here. I'll tighten that up and bring in the bottom panel just a little bit more. And, the crowning achievement, of course, we have to have a pile of moose nuggets. Yeah. Should I stick with the rule of 3? Or maybe I'll do even more. I'll just have a medley, an assortment of moose nuggets here. Not too many, just the right amount. And one of the reasons why I've established the point of view this close is because it all comes down to the moose nuggets. And if they're really, really small, you gotta, what are they? So you want to draw them big, and so everything else has to kind of domino effect in reverse. So everything else has to be kind of big. Okay, so I've got some moose nuggets, and I'll lightly pencil in some of this glitter effect here. A little shiny highlight mark on these. And this is going to be reflected in my eyes as well. I'll plug that in. And this is, again, maybe we're splitting hairs here, pole vaulting over moose turds, and maybe asking for too much meaning in this. Cartoon is basically a silly picture, a silly drawing. Can't really get much more basic than that. There is a meta layer behind this of marketing, and I'm making fun of consumer culture. Okay, buy anything. Ooh, look, it's glittering. Marketing. So marketing is caption, and then down here I'll pencil in first the words, the sub caption. If you feed a moose glitter, then the nuggets will sparkle. Here's an advantage to penciling things out first, because things will get a little cramped over here. So when I actually do go back in and ink this in, for one thing, I'm going to shift things over, start things all over, and I'll take extra special care here in lettering. Lettering is different than writing. Writing is something that you do unconsciously and very, very fast. It's kind of like when artists worry about finding their personal style, and I have all of them write their names down on a little index card. I say, write your name real quick, just a couple seconds. Boom, I'm going to put them all up, and sure enough, you'll have 10 or 12 distinct, unique, different styles. And a style is what happens when you're not paying attention, and the signature is a good way to express that, to see that. Writing, though, when you're lettering, it's different than writing, because you're paying attention to each individual letter. If you feed a... So it's just shifted a little bit more. And You want to make sure your lettering is clear enough and concise enough, because just like with the cartoon, with the drawing, with a lot of kinds of art, it's visual communication. You're trying to impart meaning as quickly as possible and not hamper the viewer's interpretation of it. So that's the first place that things are going to fall apart, is when your lettering is not clear. Most people are not blessed with good handwriting or lettering or printing skills in any way. So it behooves you to spend some time. There are other cartoonists that generate computer programs based on their handwriting. I prefer, this is the ultimate in personal touch. This is your handwriting. So I really love the hand lettering part of it, and that carries through some of the other cartoons that I enjoy to read. Okay, so a couple other things to make sure I'm getting everything here. That so for this overall composition, okay, working it out, this becomes unconscious with experience, I think, but at this stage, it's pretty good to make sure everything is in order. I'm actually going to go through here and make sure I darken up these lines so that they can be seen. Beefing up some lines before I ink. That's I will deviate significantly from my original lines even when I am inking, but since this is a special, I want to make sure everything is just perfect for it. Some foreground elements, the nuggets, a little bit of texture here and there. And so it's interesting too, another thing that I want to talk about when I've done this composition, this layout here, is that if I was going to go by, say, one of the grand poobahs of the medium, Scott McCloud, in Understanding Comics, makes it clear that a single panel gag cartoon is not a comic, it's a cartoon. And where he's coming from with that is that it doesn't have those gutters, so it doesn't play around with the passage of time per se. So there's a lot of elements that are in a comic strip or a graphic novel that are not present in a single panel gag cartoon. That said, my entire thesis paper for an MFA at Savannah College of Art and Design in the sequential art department was predicated on the squeezing out or the de facto abandoning of single panel gag cartoons, which should be the cornerstone of comics, because I could make the argument here that this is sequential even though there is not any panel gutters and other strips, because when you look at this panel, there's a process. You don't simultaneously process the entire piece at once. You visually and cognitively assemble these elements, in other words, put together in your head the pieces of the puzzle, and in theory, hopefully, it will result in the aha moment of getting it when there's a resolution. There's a setup, a resolution. Now, in a comic strip, it's easy to see because it's paced along with traditional comedy. First panel will be the setup, and then there's timing and pacing involved, there's beats involved, and then there's delivery at the end. And in order to orchestrate all of these elements into one single panel, there are some things you can do. Again, there's many other different kinds of panels which are much, much more simpler. They're just a silly picture. But this is some of the process that goes on in the background. In the meantime, I've set up this caption here that says, this caption box that's floating inside the panel, that has the smart-ass marketing caption label in here. And so the viewer's eye is going to first go to marketing, and then is going to go visually through here like I've traced out before, following the gaze, the down, snakes through, foreground right here, and then finishing up with, if you feed a moose glitter, then the nuggets will sparkle. Okay, so you've got this flow of information that's being fed to the viewer. And so there is arguably to some degree, there's timing and pacing even within the confines of a single panel. Again, if the viewer is a Western viewer and reading from left to right and top to bottom, so the processing of these little elements are all going to add up to here. It takes seconds, but still, it's a kind of an interesting process to still work through. Okay, so we've worked over some pictorial depth, the composition, deliberate arrangement of these elements, foreground, midground, background, pictorial depth here. Talked a little bit about materials. I think I'm about ready to pencil. I'm done. I'm good with this as it stands right now. For inking, I generally use anywhere from 3 to 6 different implements, different tools to ink with in my box that I carry around with me and at home in the studio. The workhorse, the basic one, is just going to be your simple, I think, Hunt 102 bowl nib. In other words, I'll have 2 dip pens. I'm kind of old school still. I'll use a thick one and a thin one, a big one and a little one for a thick line and a thin line. So I use dip pens. There are multiple different kinds of inks. I'll use this Winsor & Newton Black India ink. Again, that's a fairly standard ink to use. Lots of different kinds out there. I love the Winsor & Newton. It's basic, pretty simple. Dip pens I love because, number one, I that's what I use most of the time. There'll always be a little characteristic smattering of marks up in the upper corners of my pages of my originals. That's so I get the ink started going. And actually, right off the bat here, well, let's see. So I'm going to go ahead and start inking here. When you use a dip pen, like I am here, you get a really nice organic line. And what I mean by that is compared and contrasted with, say, using a micron pen or any other sort of marker, which has a fixed line weight. It's it's a dead line. It's never going to change in its width or thickness. Okay, and I find that, personally for me, I find these dip pens have a lot of flexibility. You can also go very, very fast in creating these drawings. Not as fast as, say, if you were using a brush, which I'll get to in a minute here. But you can still achieve a wide variety of different line weights. And again, you're dealing with something here that your average viewer is going to gloss right over, well, not even notice, I guess. But these are some of the elements that will add up to a successful picture, I guess, as well. At least understanding how some of these things work. When you're inking in a page, you want to start from the middle and work your way out. Also, when I'm inking with a dip pen, you can notice this is different drawing in that I'm drawing from the wrist and from the fingers, so it's a very tightly controlled way of drawing as opposed to doing, say, figure drawing with charcoal on an easel. And I'm also pretty much keeping all of my motions in this direction, because if I go this way and dig in, it's going to catch on the paper and flick ink all over you, which will not be funny. You want to laugh at the picture, not what I do. But that said, I can still get away here and there with moving in the opposite direction I'm supposed to, because I'm working on really good Bristol board, and it's very, very smooth, and it responds very, very well to my to the pressure that I'm using when I ink. Okay. Now, more and more as time goes by, I try to get my originals to be 100% as is. Like, I don't need to digitally erase anything. That's a noble goal. Isn't always met, but and I'm also, you'll know, I'm deviating quite a lot from my original pencil lines. That's okay. A nice bold line. So when things are moving closer to the foreground here, they're going to become bolder. I'm going to get into how to fix that blurb that I just did there, which is really good. There's a couple things that you can do. You can always have your emergency roll of toilet paper at the table's edge here. It's good to have a mistake to show that, and just wind it up and slurp up that big old blob of ink. And later on I can get back in with a razor blade, scrape that away, or I will use either white acrylic paint or some bleed-proof whiteout, not the stuff that everybody else uses, because the solvents will react with the ink and you'll wind up with a wonderful gray That's what I get for talking when I'm trying to draw, not paying attention to what I'm drawing. So I'm pushing down pretty hard here on this, maybe even going back over, because I want the foreground elements to be really, really bold. And for a lot of times, for many of these, I will use a brush, which just as a quick side lecture here, using a brush. This was probably, I don't know, what, 90% of other cartoonists used a brush to do their inking with. I'll do a quick little demo with it here. And this is a Winsor & Newton Sable Brush Series number 7, which is pretty much the standard for inking. So 90% of old school artists would use a brush, and because that's even more of a wonderful, luscious, organic line weight variation when you're using a brush instead of a dip nib. As opposed to most painting or watercoloring that use brushes in different ways, when you're inking with comics and cartooning, it all comes down to the point. It's all about that point. And bracing with a finger here and using this, with just the slightest little bit of pressure, I can get a really wonderful variation in the line weight for this. And it's just an absolutely wonderful tool that you can move really fast with as well, and you can get some really nice bold lines, really great lines too that will stand out when you ink with one of these. It's just a matter of personal preference and habit, I guess, but you can kind of see how I'm getting some really nice lines here. I'll probably just keep this one figure here. Keep these brush strokes, which will be really nice, because what's going to happen with this is in just those mere seconds of somebody looking at this panel, this is going to register a little bit quicker than items in the background, because it has a slightly bolder line, so you can accentuate certain elements and aspects of a panel that way. One of the values of penciling things in is I'm able to kind of map things out and keep certain areas clear. I'm not going to ink in those because I'm going to come back later and ink with them. So I've got a little bit of a part of this drawing done with a brush, which is also good to see. Now, put that aside and return to our inking. We'll see how messy I can get this, so it'll be ironic that this podcasted, filmed demonstration will be one of the worst inkings I've ever done. The bolder the line that I use here, the quicker I will run out of ink and need to replenish. Almost done with the main primary elements here, and I'll use while I'm at it, I will use this and finish off the face over here, because I want a little bit lighter line, a little bit more detailed than I would use with the brush. Go ahead and I'll come back and use another tool for inking in the spot blacks, the areas that are just solid black. And also the elements that are going to be super fine details when I will use an additional, either I'll use another dip pen that's really, really thin, or I'll use a micron marker instead. Yes, I think I have the perfect besotted expression. I must buy it. Whatever it is, I must buy it. So I think I've got all those elements. Now I'm going to go ahead and get the background layer here, kind of connect the dots. That's still actually a habit of mine, held over from when I first started using computers to cartoon with. I was using the old freehand programs, and I would vector the artwork, and so it's still kind of a reflexive habit for me to make sure all of my paths are closed before I scan them in. I just use Facebook, or I just use Edit. I just use Photoshop now. Let's get these nuggets done. They're not perfect little spheres, but I'm leaving for last. I'm working successively with the layers in the drawing, and now I'm working my way through the items that are really bold, the big areas, working from big to little, and I will finish up with the detailed areas. You know, can always use a few more nuggets. Yeah, we'll have some pointers over to here as well. All right, that's that. And last but not least, I'm going to throw in some grass in the foreground here. Some grass over here. Finishing that up. So this is nice, having a little framing device in the drawing okay, and I think I'm just about, I'm looking over here and I'm done using this nib. Clean that up. And there are a couple other implements that I can use as well. One, again, going back to being a brush, you can use an artificial brush. Pentel pocket brushes. This is a Pitt artist pen. So in these kits, they'll have bold, fine, extra fine, and then usually an artificial brush, which doesn't hold up, doesn't last very long. But that's good for using spot blacks, which is why I got it out. So I can get in here and knock in some of these areas, which would take a little bit longer if I was using the dip pen. So there are going to be some areas in the drawing that have some nice spot blacks as well. So I want to get everything finished here using that tool. Then I'll use a thick and a thin micron lines. These are God's gift to cartoonists here, archival ink in these. And I'm going to throw in a little bit of texture. Okay, just some stippling. There are lots of different marks that are employed by cartoonists. Hatching, cross-hatching, scumbling, stippling. Ways to show a little bit of texture to kind of visually break up the areas here, so that when we look at this we say, aha, ground, here's some dirt. So I'm kind of moving around here. I'm starting to plug in some areas. Also going to make it so that this is a little bit of fixing things up here. This is also a way to a real slight subtle value, like a spotlight effect. So I want it dark on the outside, and this will be the area the moose nuggets in there. And one way to do that is to stipple in some texture that will achieve a gradation for value here as well. I also use these microns pretty much exclusively for lettering as well. This is awkward. I want to make sure you don't drag your finger through here, so I'm going to normally, actually at this time, sometimes I start with the lettering and get that out of the way, or I'll let it dry. We'll finish up here with using, I will use a Sharpie, so I want to get some spot blacks in here. How to draw an Alaskan spruce tree. I'll use a really, really crappy, beat up old brush here. And I find that this gets those wonderful forms done pretty quickly. This also serves, again, tucking something underneath the panel border because it helps imply that there's a continuation of this scenario that extends beyond the borders of the cartoon, so it reinforces this window. In other words, if I put things going off panel like this and have them underlapping, there's that word again, some of the forms in the foreground here, that helps accentuate the illusion of pictorial depth. Okay, helps frame things a little bit better. I'll move around here and just kind of give it a few more little splotches here so that it looks pretty good, I think, so far. Alright, that aspect is done, so we've got a little bit of the brushwork done there, and I want to letter now, going back to I'll use a Micron 08 with this lettering down here. Again, taking special care when to letter rather than write. And it's an important thing to think about that when you're lettering. You're making marks on a piece of paper. There's symbols that stand for something, and how you letter will influence the interpretation of the words. It'll affect the words. In other words, if you embolden some of the words unconsciously in your mind, unless you like to read out loud, those words will have a little bit more special import or impact because they'll read louder, which is kind of weird. So if I'll go back over here, this will be the part where you can fast forward through this or speed it up. If you feed a moose, so I'm going to bolden this. If you feed a moose, actually I'm going to refer back to my notes. If you feed a moose, now I'm going to emphasize this. If you feed a moose glitter, so bolden this up just a little bit so that it's going to read with emphasis, because there isn't actually any glitter present here. So glitter, and the Nuggets So I've got that done. I'm going to reach up here and I've kind of painted myself into the corner here, or inked myself into the corner, so I got to be careful not to smear things. So I've got that figured out. One other thing I want to do with my thin, so that was a 0.08 or an 08, and there's an 03 one, is get in this last little touches of detail. Gotta have these gotta have the glitter sparkle, the highlights of these. Coming in, get back in, make sure I get the eyes here. And maybe a couple little touches of detail and some texture scattered throughout here. And that looks pretty good. I'm just going to kind of, I should give the moose a little bemused eyebrow here as well. Okay. That look, I think everything else is pretty much knocked in here. Last but not least, knock in the panel, the border here. I like, this is actually the only time that I will use a ruler in the cartoons, because I like the contrast between a static, fixed, dead, straight line. It's a nice contrast against the contents, which are going to a little bit more life to them. So I'll have, I'll do a whole bunch of these, ink them in, and let them sit overnight at least. Then the next day I can go back there and erase, scan the work in, and then work on the digital print version. And after a while, I'll return to the original and apply some color wash to the piece as well. Okay, so in essence, I'm almost creating two different works. So this is a panel that's pretty much done now, and I have to let it dry because it's still very, very wet, and then I'll erase it, scan it, and maybe last chances for a little bit of touch-up here and there. And I think that's working pretty good. I'm happy with where that's at. But what we'll do is we'll let this dry. I'll erase it, scan it, digitize it, and add the grayscales, and then also do a wash of this original, and you will see that later as well, hopefully with the finished print version as well. But what I'm going to do is put this aside for a minute here, and I'll walk you through real quick. There's a panel, a really good example of a line art. This is the original done here, finished up, really nice contrast between the organic lines, thick, bold organic lines here with the more static, fixed, dead lines that kind of reflect the content of a storage unit here. But again, it's kind of empty, leaves me wanting. Okay, and here's an example of a piece that I have started doing wash on. Instead of the old way of traditionally doing a wash, I just use Derwent Sketching, a water-soluble wash pencil. You can see I've already started plugging in some areas here. This is the advantage to using permanent India ink as well, so you can apply a wash to it later and have your lines still stay, and not bleed all over the place. And so here what I'm doing now is just as a quick demonstration, going to kind of reinforce plugging in some areas here of wash. This has been dried, but I can always go back in later on and apply some more wash. These wash pencils are just wonderful. Usually they had this. There was this stuff called film, and it used to come in these little film canisters, and you'd line up all the film canisters and fill them up with water, and you'd put a couple drops of India ink in the first one, maybe 4 in the next one, 8 in the next one, 12 in the next one. So you'd have this whole range of grayscales, of tones. I much prefer this version because it's a little bit quicker and easier. And so as soon as you hit it up with water, it breaks up that value and turns into a really nice wash. And I also do this with color, which I'll show in a second here. So I'm just kind of beefing up my areas here, moving around. This is a really nice way to get some value, some additional depth into the piece. I know professional watercolorists about now that their eyeballs are going to start bleeding, but this is also my revenge from all those teachers that ever tried to keep me within the lines. And I'm using a different medium here, this wet medium, and it's just, you get these happy accidents that just happen. So I will apply wash to it. Here's an example of a color wash piece as well. So cartoonists spoil everything. There's a nice Alaskana scene, and me out there, wow, look at all the whiteout. Oh, hush. So there's an example, again, using water-soluble pencils just to achieve some color instead. And the whole process in a nutshell with this panel, there's another really good example of what happens to the original, where I'll have, this is based on a true story of one of my cats likes to sleep in my coats, and when it was very cold, sometimes he'll wind up getting bundled along with everything else that I have to wear. So here's a fella, hey, wait, have you seen the cat lately? And hidden in here is a cat. So it's deliberately overwhelming, buried in texture. So here we have an example of the hatching technique, cross-hatching, gradation from dark to light. We have more just regular hatching. As soon as you go the other way, it's cross-hatching. We have a lot of stippling down here. So there's a lot of texture in here. So here's the line art, again with that little telltale series of marks in the corner there. So that was the original for it. This is a scan of it, actually. And then after it gets scanned in and digitally treated, and I plug in the Nuggets header and my signature if I haven't done it yet. Here's the version of it in print. Seeing as how it's on newsprint, that adds another 10% or something like that gray to it, so everything gets darkened down even more. And especially compared to the original here, you can see it's a quarter of its size. It gets reduced down. One of the awesome things about being in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner for all these years is I am not restricted to a real formulaic, say with the syndicated strips, where just tiny postage stamp sized panels, and you're always the same size. Every day, every cartoon you draw is the same one. For myself, I'm very fortunate that form follows function. So if I need it to be a vertical or horizontal, if I need it to be big, I've done whole pages before. I've done strips. So I'm very fortunate with that. But here you can see an example of how it's just a quarter of the original size, and now you can pretty clearly see the areas of cross hatching that went in, and I treated this with a color wash as well. So that's a good example of the process for it. And I will do a quick little demo to finish up here on this panel. Here's the pen and ink version of it. The old-timer couple in their cabin. Are you making bacon? Nope, must be that dang swine flu. I think this was the worst joke of the year when the swine flu epidemic was happening. And so here we have a little piggy snout and a little piggy tail. So anybody that has, for years in my cabin, I had wood heat. This is one of the first cabins I've ever had. Now we're using a furnace instead. But so here we have a really bad gag, basically. Dumb joke. It all comes down to a funny picture or a dumb joke. And we see a really good example of boldening the text here. Are you making bacon? Nope. Must be that dang swine flu. So when you're visually reading this, it has a little bit more emphasis translated into your head as well. And moving back, so we've got a whole range again of different textures. Don't have any spot blacks in here, which I'll have to fix. But again, using these wash pencils, even if I do a color wash now, I will initially treat the page with a layer of black ink as well. Excuse me, here I am. I can't talk and draw at the same time again. Even though I will go back in and do a color panel, I'll still have my base layer here. I'll plug in some gray values. Okay. I'll go back over it with color, but I wanted to have this shading as well. So I'm just kind of moving around here and plugging in some areas. And where I have speech bubbles, balloons like this, or caption text boxes for captions inside at home, I have a liquid mask, a stop out that I'll use, and I'll go over these areas, and it will put a temporary film over it and let that dry, so then I can do wash with impunity and then go back in with the eraser and get rid of that stuff, and it'll look really nice and spiffy. Unfortunately, this one is not. That's okay though. Like I said, I'm not. Oh, I also want to keep this area clear here too, because another part of that assembling the pieces together, and there may be one here, theory of humor, that when the viewer is more of an active participant in the process, that enhances the enjoyment when they get it. Okay, you don't want to make it too obvious, too simple, or it's too easy. Okay, and you also don't want to make it I am too hard for them to get, because I get accosted fairly regularly, unfortunately. There are people that were like, well, they'll remember for weeks, months even. They'll be like, hey, I really, really tried to get that one. I still don't get it. It's like, and then you have to tell them what it was, and it was basically a bad joke, and it's like dissecting a balloon. It's not funny anymore. So one of the things I'm going to do with this wash here as well, using a napkin here to pick this up, is I want to accentuate this area. I don't want to hide the joke too much, so I'm going to make it dark on the outside so you can focus in, and that little piggy snout on the stove is going to become a little bit more apparent. Okay, so go ahead here, and this is the initial layer of wash too. Like you saw with the other example that I started off with, I'll come back to it later and work it up a little bit more. This is actually one of the things that I enjoy to do when I'm out in public at a signing or at a booth at a craft market or what have you, which I'll be at a fair number of this season. This is something that I generally I'll have it quiet in the studio when I'm coming up with ideas. And then I'll usually have music playing in the background when I'm inking, because I've done all of the hard parts in my sketchbook already, so I don't have to really think all that much about it, pay that much attention, and I definitely don't have to at this point, just plugging in some areas of value. So this is something really good to do when I'm at a table in a crowd or doing demos in classrooms, which I really enjoy doing as well. So I'm going to establish some basic key areas of value here. Later on I can go in and beef up a little bit more, add some color. The less water that I use on this, the darker those lines are going to be. So I can get back in here again and layer in some more. I can also, on another sheet of paper, load up another area here, pick up some from here, and bring it in so I can have, like, here's a good example. I can add in a little touch right there of some darker areas. And this is wet on wet, so if I wanted to let it dry, I could just go back in there and hit it up with the wash pencil again. So moving around here, like for this book, if I want to make that a little bit darker while it's still wet, and go back over to my little swatch here that I made of some darker stuff and push that back a little bit more. I like using the brush. It's infuriating to have something in my hands that I don't have any control over as much as I'm used to. And I'm also just one more little quick thing here. Notice that on this one, on the original, his head is kind of misshapen. I need to white that line out. And it looks like I had the same thing here where his butt was a little bit tucked up in here. And I need to get rid of those lines. So I'm going to show how to, I can get rid of that on the original. One of the reasons people like looking at, buying, seeing original comics too is it's art that's intended for reproduction. So it doesn't really matter what you do to this. You can cut out other pieces of Bristol board and glue it on top of it. Use a razor blade to scrape away areas of ink that you don't want. Use a white acrylic paint to be an example. So I could spend time getting here, and since Bristol board is fairly thick and forgiving, I could get in here and I could start scraping it away if I wanted to spend the time, or use this acrylic paint or a professional whiteout. I'll use that now instead. So I can get in here, and this would be one of those things that it's kind of cool. You can tell on the original that where this stuff is used. And I think this brush has just about outlived its usefulness. Time to buy a new brush. Or actually to use one of the older ones, recycle it. Okay, so now I can get back in there and kind of fix up this line. Not a big deal. But hey, so I've got, I'll probably white out this a little bit line here, just to call a little bit more attention. I want to leave a little bit of a breathing room around the joke, the primary element. I mean, we've got play on words. This is a little fun with language. I have no shame, so it's a really dumb joke. But I want to accentuate that to a certain degree with a visual portion. So I'll have a little bit of a breathing room around there. And that's another thing that Scott McCloud covers a little bit. Where he in his book Understanding Comics identifies a series of categories for juxtaposition of image and text. In other words, this is sequential art. So we have pictures and words joined together. Let's see what his technical definition would be. Juxtapose pictorial or other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. In the case of this, a dumb joke, it's a gag, so you're not necessarily establishing a narrative, you're just telling a joke. And he identifies, this is actually one of the funnest things about using image and text, is the relationship between the pictures and the words. To go back to see another example here, I had this one. I charred the char. Now all we have for dinner is charred. So I'm just have some more homonyms. Wordplay. I love that. That's just probably at the core of my bad jokes and gags that have anything to do with puns, things like that. And going back to say this one here, the marketing one about sparkly moose nuggets. So McLeod identifies some areas, word specific or picture specific. In other words, there are some cartoons where all the information is conveyed through the picture alone, and the words are just kind of an afterthought. They don't add anything to it, or the reverse. If it's word specific and not the words pretty much say everything, and the picture just essentially illustrates that. Another one would be intersecting, which I think this one would qualify for. The information is conveyed together, both the picture and the words, and to some degree it's also expressed independently. So it's working hand in glove. In other words, just reading the words isn't good enough, and just looking at the picture isn't good enough. You need the two together in order to get the main joke. And then there is another one, interdependent, where the idea, it communicates a meta concept when both are juxtaposed together. Okay, and then there's another one he identifies called a parallel, which I'll get into in another podcast, I think, which is more of a poet jazz kind of process of putting pictures with words that don't necessarily make any sense whatsoever. Okay, so I think we're almost, while this is dry, I'm going to, again, I'll erase this, scan it in, and we'll take a look and see what it looks like in print and the digital version, and on the original when I wash it with some color as well.